Hi, my name is Barb Kozee. I'm a second-year Master of Divinity student at Jesuit School of Theology. I want to begin by thanking our editors at Lumen at Vita for hosting a variety of student perspectives. I'm reading a paper titled Incorporating Queer Housing Insecure Perspectives into Eucharistic Theology. The embodied nature of our Christian faith has been distinctly enriching at the same time as it has posed significant challenges. A gift of our belief in divine embodiment through Christ has been our tradition's sacralization of the human body, a true grace for those of us who consistently fail at seeing ourselves as beautiful, made in the image of God. Bodily shame has corrupted our communion with God and each other, and this has significantly impacted Christian embodied theology, proving our faith to be one of prophetic vision for what freedom and liberation truly mean, as well as a human institution that has been unambiguously oppressive and cruel. To concretize this statement, consider how M. Sean Copeland's In Fleshing Freedom reveals the way that traditional theological anthropology has failed the American Black woman. Copeland beautifully articulates the tension between enrichment and challenge for those on the margins of Christian theology, when she ends her book saying, quote, Jean-Luc Marion writes that theology of all writing causes the greatest pleasure. For the theologian of the Black experience, writing theology may also evoke the deepest sorrow, the deepest gratitude, the deepest love. This paper hopes to continue a Copeland-esque tradition of deep sorrow, gratitude, and love for the faith by considering the relationship between the Eucharist and desire in a way that centers the LGBTQ person who experiences homelessness. Perhaps the very reason that treating embodiment and bodily shame has been so troubling within the Christian tradition has been our murky relationship with the concept of desire. As resistance to shame-based frameworks of theology, this paper aims to understand the Eucharist through a lens of desire and to map this onto the material world. This paper argues that the Christian Eucharistic tradition is one of radical table fellowship. The root of the practice is a reorienting and subversive desire for intimate communion with the margins. Secondly, this paper will use socioeconomic data on the relationship between race, sexual and gender identity, and homelessness to argue that our desires are materially consequential and interconnected. This will lead to a conversation on temporality as it relates to the Eucharist, queerness, and social change. This paper will show that a Eucharistic theology that stays faithful to its tradition of radical table fellowship rooted in desire of and for the margins requires ending homelessness immediately. While the Eucharistic tradition is often seen as a sacrament built upon communion and fellowship, queer Christian theologians have interrogated this concept further and supposed that, quote, erotic energy sits at the heart of the Christian faith and practice, quote. J. Johnson's Divine Communion begins with this notion, moving from the biblical comparison between the Eucharist and the image of a wedding banquet. Johnson builds off of a queer tradition that has tried to interrogate the depths of desire. Audre Lorde's chapter on the uses of the erotic defines eroticism as, quote, providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The dichotomy between the spiritual and the political is false, resulting from an incomplete attention to our erotic knowledge. For the bridge that connects them is formed by the erotic, the passions of love and its deepest meanings, quote. For Johnson, Lorde, queer theorists, and queer theologians, eroticism is an energy that includes but is not limited to the sexual, and that is rooted in a deep desire for intimacy and union. In this essay, desire is erotic and transcendent of our modern spheres of distinction. It is Lorde's bridge. Let us return to the newly bold claim then, that the Eucharist is the erotic desire of and for the margins, and begin with Jesus's historic practice of meal sharing. Jesus's Eucharistic table fellowship is described as radical because he is widely acknowledged by biblical scholars to have eaten with sinners throughout the New Testament. Julie Rubio gives a succinct overview of traditional and recent scholarship on the sociocultural elements of Jesus's table fellowship in her book, Family Ethics. Jesus's table was a scandalous one for the ancient Near Eastern world that he lived in. especially for the clerical elite who were critical of his disrespect for purity law, which forbade eating with sinners. Jesus' meal-sharing practices challenged social hierarchies. Meals operated as symbols of social structure that reinforced the honor-shame code of the ancient Near Eastern culture in first-century Palestine. For this reason, Rubio notes that, quote, eating with sinners or social outcasts made no sense, quote. Instead of remaining complicit with the isolating and hierarchical cultural norms of his time, Jesus resisted through a desire to know those whose knowing was highly discouraged. This challenged the very social function of the shared meal itself. Jesus disrupted a cultural symbol of division by flipping it on its head. Today, we might call these meals acts of protest or cultural resistance. Responding to scholarship that posits that Jesus ate with sinners in order to offer them forgiveness and salvation, Rubio reminds us that Jesus, quote, ate with sinners before any discussion about salvation had taken place, before any new promises had been made. Jesus' choice of eating companions must mean something more, quote. Here, we can begin to see the role of desire in Eucharistic table fellowship. Not only was Jesus' table anti-hierarchical, it was also a table of grace, a table of being without any expectation of what becoming will look like. I argue that being without expectation was Jesus' expression of erotic desire for the margins. Jesus did not eat with the margins in order to save them, but to intimately know them. Jesus' table fellowship is made important via his final meal celebration with some of his closest friends, what we refer to as the Eucharist. The cultural and historical significance of Jesus' meals is sacralized in the eschatology of the Eucharist that collapses the past into the present, into the future. Copeland describes Eucharist as, quote, that inalienable gift that anchors believers in time, connects them to one another as well as to their origin, and intimates their future, quote. Systematic theologians have contended that the past, the present, and the future are all present in the Eucharistic sacrament. In this way, the Christian vision of God supersedes time and indeed supersedes our ability to fathom time. Johnson comments that the eschatological imagination of Eucharistic practice, quote, continually feeds that vision of being at home with one another, free of violent oppressions, where the glory of bodily intimacy shines freely and unimpeded by the controlling forces of empire, regardless of the form those forces take, quote. For Johnson, Eucharistic eschatology is imaginative and unhindered by the various manifestations of empire across human cultures. John Zazoulas also shows the eschatological significance of the Eucharistic table. He highlights the troubling issue for Christians of how to make meaning of the Eucharist in a society post-crucifixion, yet living before the end times. This issue is resolved in the presence of the Holy Spirit, a Trinitarian theology of divine presence detailed explicitly in John's Gospel. The Trinitarian God remains present and active in the Eucharistic celebration and allows for a transcendence and collapsing of time, seen in descriptions from the book of Revelation that show how, quote, the Eucharist should not be considered as a reality parallel to heaven, but as identical to it, quote. The Christian ritualization and institutionalization of radical table fellowship with the margins is rooted in these eschatological aspects of the Eucharistic sacrament, where many become one in heavenly moments of union. I move toward a particularly queer relationship to housing justice that takes seriously socioeconomic data about housing insecurity and homelessness, and that understands Lord's erotic bridge between sexual and material desires. Housing insecurity and homelessness disproportionately affect the LGBTQ community. A theological interpretation of this data shows that our sexual desires can inform our material desires, and that there is a responsibility of the Eucharistic table to meet the needs of queer people. Recognizing the interconnectedness of different manifestations of erotic desire brings us beyond the table of tokenization toward true intimacy. Establishing housing justice as queer erotic desire can be accomplished through an interrogation of persisting and recent data on queer identity and homelessness. While LGBTQ youth comprise 5 to 8% of the US youth population, they make up at least 40% of youth experiencing homelessness. 46% of homeless LGBT youth ran away because of family rejection of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 43% were forced out by parents, and 32% faced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse at home. It is clear from these statistics that disclosing sexual or gender identity can put youth at risk of violence and severe trauma. Much of the conversation around LGBTQ homelessness has been shaped by these devastating statistics regarding queer youth, but recent data suggests that housing insecurity persists into LGBTQ adulthood. A May 2020 press release from UCLA School of Law details the findings of the first study of its kind to provide estimates for the percentage of sexual and gender minority adults experiencing homelessness. The findings show that 17% of sexual minority adults have experienced homelessness in their lifetime, compared to 6% of the general population. Sexual minorities suffer homelessness at more than double and close to triple the rates of straight people. The breakdown of who is being impacted by homelessness can also be seen along the lines of race and gender. According to the same UCLA study, 6% of LGBTQ African Americans experienced recent housing instability compared to 3% of Latinx queers and 2% of white queers. Further, the National Center for Transgender Equality reports that 20% of transgender individuals have experienced homelessness at some point, and 10% of trans people have been evicted because of their gender identity. The data shows that within the LGBTQ community, housing insecurity persists as an issue into adulthood, with racial minorities and trans individuals disproportionately affected. The experiences of the queer community show that understanding your sexual and gender identity, choosing to reject shame, and embracing your body can and do result in the loss of housing and basic needs, a relationship that is located within systemic racial injustices. In this way, sexual and romantic desire appear as materially consequential. Further, queer people often must choose between these desires. Am I safe to hold my partner's hand here? Is the emotional or physical harm that I endure in my household worth the roof over my head? To an extreme extent within the lives of queer and trans people, especially people of color, who have experienced homelessness, and to a subliminal extent within the lives of the entire queer community, the relationship between sexual and material desire is a constant negotiation. Lord suggests that, quote, once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of, quote. Feeling the liberation of our queer sexual desires can inform our desire to seek this joy and liberation from our economic frameworks as well. The queer community has something important to say about material concerns regarding housing and shelter as a human right, and a Eucharistic theology that authentically desires the margins must desire their fullness. Without this commitment, including queer people at the table is simply tokenization. Because of our Eucharistic tradition that calls us to intimacy, this should not be a peripheral concern, but rather a central concern of faith-based housing justice movements. Eucharistic theology that desires queer people requires ending homelessness immediately. The final section of this paper will explore the relationship between the Eucharist and immediacy related to our economic decisions. The temporal sacred mystery of the Eucharist problematizes modern gradual frameworks of change that serve to desacralize time. The queer inclusive Eucharistic table expands our horizons of possibility and reminds us of the radical potentiality of every infinite future present. Queer theologian Elizabeth Stewart shows that laughter in the face of death represents a queering of and therefore a returning to the Eucharistic tradition of radical hope that lies in resurrection. She emphasizes that a Christian death is uniquely camp and comedic because of Christ's resurrection. In this way, a lived Eucharistic practice is fearless because we know that empire, capitalism, and oppression are not how the story ends. Further, post-colonial theology has argued for viewing the future as currently emergent and observing the hope that accompanies this perspective. Queering and decolonizing the Eucharist may therefore mean hope for an emerging future that approaches social change through seeing the sacred value and possibility of each moment. Every moment that homelessness continues to be a reality within our economic framework is a moment that fails to live out Eucharistic union and disrespects the queer people experiencing homelessness that are a part of our community. Every future present that normalizes the idea that housing is not a human right scandalizes our Christian faith and contributes to the imperfect celebration of the Eucharist at our weekly liturgies. Incorporating postmodern frameworks for social change that accompany communion with queer people and our tradition will require striving to bring an end to homelessness into the here and now. People of faith who believe in the intimacy and mystery found in the Eucharist must move from complacency to immediate action that would radically shift our economic institutions and their approach to resource allocation. Immediate action is hard for us to imagine in the US where bureaucracy prevails, but I believe that we must expand our moral imagination if we are to stay faithful to Christ's commitment to listening and being at those radical meals all those years ago. The Eucharist is a hopeful taste of heaven and should serve as a reminder of the sacredness and rich potential for change and reconciliation embedded in every moment of being alive. Once we start living like this, we will be one step closer to glimpsing that heavenly wedding banquet that we yearn for each Sunday. Thank you.